All right, welcome to the our special council meeting and roll call. Members of council are present. Councilor Tonio is on personal leave. We'll dispense with the land acknowledgement that was done in a previous meeting. Any disclosure of pecuniary interest on the agenda is presented to you this afternoon. Hearing none, we'll have that duly noted. And so I'll believe you do some introductions and so, Mr. Martinick.
Thank you, Your Worship. Good evening, Your Worship and members of council. I just want to do a brief introduction to our presenters, Mr. Mark Hernandez from Dillon Consulting and Mr. Alan Michaud from Landmark Engineers. Also just wanted to have a few speaking points here on the report that's also on the agenda before you before we jump into the presentation. So the Turkey Creek Watershed is approximately 6,200 hectares in size, and the contributing flows are from the city of Windsor, Tecumseh, and LaSalle, mainly from the urban areas. The watershed has had some significant alterations over the years due to urbanization and construction, the most recent being the Herb Gray Parkway. Through discussions between IRCA and the affected municipalities, it was agreed that various ongoing studies would benefit from a more coordinated approach in updating the hydrology and hydraulics to support study inputs, assumptions, recommendations, and ongoing growth and development within the area. IRCA, acting on behalf of Tecumseh, LaSalle, and Windsor, retained the two consulting engineers here today to complete the hydrologic and hydraulic modeling study for the Turkey Creek watershed. I also want to point out and advise council that IRCA, on behalf of the municipal partners, did submit an application to the National Disaster Mitigation Program intake number 6, and they were successful. So the project received 50% funding up to $182,000. The total study costs were $420,000 with cost sharing as follows: Windsor at 85%, LaSalle at 11%, and Tecumseh at 4%. The town's total cost net of the grant is approximately $9,500. And with that, Your Worship, if I could turn it over to the two delegations here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening again. My name is Mark Hernandez with Dillon Consulting, and I was the project manager for the Turkey Creek study. I'm here tonight with Alan Michaud from Landmark Engineers, who was the technical lead for the study. And we're fortunate to be here tonight to share some good news with you. The original floodline study dates back to 1982. And while there was a subsequent study that was completed in 1991, a gauge issue was subsequently identified that compromised the data in that report. And so as such, the 1982 data has governed ever since. In addition, several studies and reports have been or were being completed within and adjacent to the Turkey Creek watershed. Recent examples of this include the town of Tecumseh's Old Castle Master Plan, the city of Windsor's Sewer Master Plan, and the town of LaSalle's Howard Bouffard Master Drainage Study. These studies did not have a current and comprehensive hydrologic and hydraulic model to incorporate these into these respective projects. In addition, the Essex Region Conservation Authority did not have updated flood levels for regulatory use. This study highlights the power of a regional approach with participation from the town of Tecumseh, city of Windsor, town of LaSalle, and with leadership from the Essex Region Conservation Authority. The Turkey Creek study not only provides a current and reliable model for many years to come, but also confirmed no significant increases in water levels and corresponding flood risk when compared to the 1982 study. Next slide, please. So the study area, the Turkey Creek watershed is approximately 64 square kilometers with contributing flows from town of Tecumseh, city of Windsor, and town of LaSalle. Drainage from Tecumseh's Old Castle area ultimately reaches the Detroit River via the Wolf Drain, the Cahill Drain, and Turkey Creek. Next slide, please. The primary objectives of the study included updating the regulatory 1 in 100 year flood levels and flows, and to develop a hydrologic and hydraulic model for use in assessing stormwater impacts of proposed projects in future studies. The secondary study objectives included quantifying the spill from the Cahill Drain into the Howard Bouffard planning area, assessing impacts of future developments, and assessing and to identify and assess opportunities to mitigate future flood risk. And now I'll turn over to Alan.
Good evening. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of the hydrologic model that we compiled for the project. So it's a detailed watershed model. It was calibrated to that Grand Maris gauge that Phil Mark alluded to. There's a lot of detail in that model. There's catchments where we've got the main drains, we've got storm sewer networks, we've got a lot of subcatchments, a lot of parameters in the background. What that model is doing, it's measuring flow. It's measuring how much rainfall becomes runoff. Next slide. So we also had a hydraulic model, and that hydraulic model setup is what you see in the snapshot right from the model environment. So that model conveys flows through main drains and bridges from the Herb Gray Parkway to the Detroit River through Turkey Creek, Cahill Drain. And what you're seeing there is a 2D adaptive mesh. And so that mesh is capturing the existing surface. When I say they use the term adaptive, it's more higher resolution, capturing the details of the drain, and it's larger mesh in the flatter terrain. That model is measuring levels. So the two models combined, one measuring flows, the other, then those flows are put into the hydraulic model to measure levels. Next slide. So this slide here, we're showing regulatory flood flows. And just to define the term regulatory, it's the 100-year flows and levels that are regulated by IRCA. And as Mark had alluded to, the regulatory 1982 were the current levels until this study, which are now intended to be the new levels, or the new regulatory levels. So this table here, there's a lot of numbers. The takeaway, it compares the 100-year, the regulatory 1982 to the 2022. This table right out of the report. A couple key things to focus in on where we've got the magnifying glass. There were some substantial increases to the Grand Maris Drain and the Turkey Creek in the order of 65, 72%. So some significant increases, and that was primarily due to the corrected rain gauge, or I'm sorry, the level gauge on the Grand Maris Drain. We also note there's a decrease to the Cahill Drain flows, and that's in the order of 63%, plus or minus. And that's primarily due to the stormwater ponds with the parkway within the Lennon Cahill sub-watersheds, as well as the Cahill spill that was quantified and that actually removes water from the Turkey Creek watershed. The Cahill spill, then some of that flow and volume goes southerly and towards the Kennard watershed. Next slide. Again, a lot more numbers here. The key takeaways is we're looking at regulatory flood levels here, where again, we're comparing the old regulatory 1982 to the 2022. And again, to note, you've got some reductions in the Cahill levels, which is not surprising. We've got lower flows. We've also accounted for the drain improvements that were done in the mid-90s on the Cahill drain. Also of note, we've got some marginal increase on Turkey Creek. That one is a bit counterintuitive at a first glance. Again, we talked about much higher flows through the Grand Maris drain and especially through Turkey Creek. But what we found is those were significantly offset by the improvements that were also done in the 1990s. And so what we end up with is a marginal increase. You got a lot of red numbers there. They're all in that 0.1, 0.22 meters, which is 0.22 meters would be the size of a standard soccer ball, to put that into perspective. So with some of those increases, what we found is that, so what we found with that increase is that it's a very nominal increase on the extents, and it has no increase in flood risk. So as Mark said, good news, good news story. Next slide. Here we've got regulatory flood extents at Turkey Creek and Cahill as an example. So we're showing the 100-year flood extents. That's the yellow hatch that you're seeing. We're showing the regulatory 2022, the new floodway limits. That's the blue line. And we're also showing how that includes the flood fringe areas, which is the hatched. And we'll come back to that area on a few subsequent or a few upcoming slides as well. So we're showing you the flood extents, the floodway, and we're showing you that section there that it's a two-zone concept. We're showing you the main floodway as well as the flood fringe. And the importance of that is that you've got the flood fringe that's some of those areas, the flood fringe can be removed. There's a corresponding level increase. And there's conditional development that's allowed within that flood fringe. And those levels with that smaller contained floodway limit have been accounted for. Next slide. The slide here just talks on the flood resiliency assessment that we undertook. So what you're seeing is a heat map. It's showing varying rainfall amounts. This is the August 2017 storm that many of you may remember, 5-6 years or just about 6 years ago now. What we're highlighting in is on the core, which was about 250 mils, which is over double of the 100-year design that we normally design to. So a very significant rainfall amount. However, that August 17 flood extent was nearly the same as the 100-year design extents. And there's some technical details as to why that happens with the variation of the rain over the area, as you can see by the heat map, as well as how the rainfall fell in that 24 hours. A lot of those details are discussed in the report. But the take home with that is that August 17 event, those flood extents very similar to that 100-year regulatory event that we are and those levels and that come out of that. We also did as a resiliency, we looked at a what if scenario. What if that core had hit other parts of the watershed? And what we determined out of that is there was the most critical occurrence was if there was more flow in the Lennon Cahill areas, and that would result in more spill at that Cahill spill and a negligible impact for everything downstream through LaSalle and onwards to Turkey Creek. Next slide. So this slide here is showing again that August 17 event, just an example. The Morton Footbridge flooded in that event. It was a fairly famous picture for those in our world. That bridge deck was below the regulatory 1982 level. So that's worth noting. You're seeing flooding, you're seeing it's overwhelming the bridge, but generally flows are still contained and not above the 82 levels. It's also showing an example of the August 17 flood extents, that yellow line, compared to the 100-year extents in the blue hatch. Again, as I said in the previous slide, there's really no noticeable difference between those two extents. Next slide. So through the report, when we looked at flood vulnerability, we determined there was a few areas that were determined to be more vulnerable. The flood extents encroach onto dwellings along Normandy Street. Again, that's that same area that we've been zooming in on with some of the other slides. It is important to note those homes were constructed prior to 1982. In other words, they didn't have that floodproofing standard. They were flood prone before 1982, and they're still more vulnerable. And if we zoom in on the topographic plan, a lot of colors, again, that's a heat map. It's showing a very low topography there. And a few of the next slides will discuss some mitigation measures for that particular area. Next slide. So this slide here is just showing an overview of some of the opportunities that we looked at to improve upon the existing conditions. So we had some improvements to the lower Turkey Creek channel, number one on the plan, improvements to the ETR bridge. We had construct dikes along private properties. That's area number 3. That's the area we've zoomed in on a few of these preceding slides. Option 4, we looked at some controls on the Titcomb drain. Option 5, we looked at adding storage at the Cahill spill to attenuate, dampen some of those flows that are spilling south towards the Kennard watershed. Option 6 and 7, we were looking at increasing flows to the Cahill and reducing flows from Grand Mare Stream. So we'll go briefly over each one of those, or maybe and spend a bit more time on option 3. So next slide. So here options 1 and 2 are combined here. This is a Google Earth image. It really shows and depicts the Phragmites overgrowth that's been happening in the lower reach of Turkey Creek. And so option 1, we've got to clean and remove the Phragmites to double the open channel width, approximately 1,700 meters of length of channel. Option 2, we looked at doubling the ETR bridge flow areas, significant reduction in head loss across the bridge if we do so. And if we combine 1 and 2, it was reducing levels below the regulatory 1982. However, not much mitigation of flood risk over the watershed and specifically at that vulnerable area that we zoomed in on Normandy Street. Next slide. So again, back to that area on Normandy Street with the flood fringe area, and what we're showing here is constructing some dikes along that private property to enclose that area would provide some significant flood risk mitigation. Next slide. This one I'll touch on very briefly. We are looking at some of the hydrodynamics with the system and potentially putting some controls there to utilize the storage in that low-lying floodplain area when you really need it, when the levels are high in the drain. What we found through the modeling is it didn't really have much benefit. Next slide. Here we looked at adding storage south of the Cahill slide. So this is the lands immediately south of that Cahill spill, excuse me. There's limited development potential in some of those areas right within the woodlot. And it could potentially be used as storage area to attenuate spill flow. And the benefit of that, attenuating the spill flow, can significantly reduce the sizing of the infrastructure required for the Howard Bouffard development. And this opportunity was to be further explored, excuse me, through the ongoing Howard Bouffard master drainage study. Next slide. This is where we looked at option 6. We looked at the potential of we looked at increasing flow to Cahill drain. So option 6 was the herb gray. What we found through the study was that there's some additional capacity in the infrastructure through the herb gray parkway leading into LaSalle into the Cahill drain. And so we identified a potential opportunity to increase flows primarily from the Old Castle area or from the Southwood Lakes areas. Then option 7, we considered that the Windsor Sewer Master Plan has recommended improvements that will ultimately reduce flows in the Grand Mares drain. However, that timeline is expected to be over 20 years, and so it wasn't considered in the current state of this for the current study. Next slide. So the key recommendations that came out of the study was that the study results should be used as the new regulatory flows and levels. In other words, the regulatory 2022. We recommended to perform routine maintenance along the main channel banks of the drains, remove brush and trees with relatively minor effort and cost. So we see on the left there is an image of an example of Cahill drain maintenance that was done. October 17, you see the drain with a lot of larger, more mature trees, and now you see it in June 2020 in that image with a clean drain. And so that was an important recommendation to keep up that routine maintenance. And when it's done routinely, you're dealing with much smaller, easier to remove small tree branches and brush and so forth. We also recommended to assess the Phragmites growth and the need for a maintenance program to ensure that it doesn't encroach and become any more narrow than it currently is. Again, recommended to consider that potential opportunity to increase flows to the Cahill drain, excuse me, as we talked about in the previous slides. And we recommended to keep the model current to reflect any change in the watershed and to maintain the same reliability that this study has achieved. Next slide. So in conclusion, we have the change in the 100-year peak flows and levels compared to the regulatory 1982. As we said, there were substantial increases in flows on Turkey and some reductions on Cahill. And we saw those noticeable decreases in levels on the Cahill and then only saw the marginal increases with no, with no impact or no flood impacts on the turkey. And then evaluation of potential opportunities. These opportunities have been identified to reduce flood levels, although the corresponding reduction in flood levels is marginal, with the exception of the diking behind the private properties susceptible to flood levels reaching the private property homes. So with that, I'll pass it to Mark for next slide.
So in terms of next steps, this study will now serve as a tool to assess the potential stormwater impacts for proposed projects and studies for years to come. It further serves as a tool when assessing costs related to proposed implementation of any such projects or studies. Moving forward for the town of LaSalle, as Alan mentioned, there's a significant opportunity related to protecting some of the flood-prone properties identified in Opportunity 3, and as well as a future consideration of the cost benefit for the improvements to the lower Turkey Creek, as well as the Essex Terminal Railway Bridge identified in Opportunities 1 and 2. The City of Windsor can move forward and consider the implementation of Opportunity number 6. And the town of Tecumseh can consider the cost benefit of increasing flows from the old Castle Hamlet. We're happy to take any questions if there are any.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen, for the presentation. Any questions or comments? Yes, go ahead, Councilor Houston.
Thank you, Worship. And through you, the only question I have is any of the options in improvements to the watershed, are those all done specifically through the Drainage Act and in the Drainage Act process for this, or does it follow some sort of a different process for those specific improvements to happen?
Thank you for the question. We're just conferring here because as I recall, not all of the Turkey Creek is a municipal drain. So depending on where that work is occurring, we have to consider what the mechanism is, particularly if we're looking at those lower downstream sections. As well, the opportunity number 2 for the bridge, even if it were under the Drainage Act, would probably be a Section 26 assessment back to the railway. For the opportunities upstream, there may be, although on it would be solution specific, basically is what I'm trying to say. It depends on where it is in the watershed, whether or not it's that section's a municipal drain. There is a portion that's on private property, so that wouldn't be a municipal drainage act, but we'd have to look at it on a case by case basis.
Further questions or comments? None at this stage. Take this opportunity to thank you, gentlemen, and certainly a very important tributary, and that helps, excuse me, the flow and protect our communities from flooding. So there is a report, members of council, if we could take report PWES 2326 entitled Turkey Creek Hydrologic and Hydraulic Modeling Study Phase 1 and 2, final reports prepared by Dillon Consultant Limited and Landmark Engineers Inc. be received. Deputy Mayor Bichetti move, supported by Councillor Jobin. No further questions or comments. All in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried. So once again, gentlemen, thank you very much for the report. All right, no further business on this particular part of our meetings this evening. Then adjournments in order. Councillor Jobin and Councillor Higginson, all in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried.